The bell of St. Michael's Church tolled noon, its sound spreading across the ruins of Göttingen like ripples on still water. It was the first time in years that the bell had rung without being followed by the wail of air raid sirens. The sound hung in the air, pure and clear, unmarred by the cacophony of war that had become so familiar that its absence now seemed more unsettling than its presence. The ringing faded, leaving behind a silence that felt both sacred and terrifying, a void waiting to be filled with something other than fear. In the cramped attic of a partially collapsed university building, Dr. Wilhelm Fischer carefully folded the last of his papers into a worn leather briefcase. His hands, once steady enough to manipulate the most delicate laboratory equipment, now trembled slightly as they moved across the creased documents covered in equations and diagrams. These papers represented a lifetime of work, theories that had altered the course of a war he had never wanted, and now threatened to alter the course of a peace he would never see. The spring of 1945 had arrived with a peculiar quality of light, different somehow from the springs before. Perhaps it was merely the absence of smoke that had perpetually hung over the city, or perhaps it was something more profound, a shift in the very atmosphere now that humanity had unleashed forces it barely comprehended. Fischer glanced around the makeshift laboratory, taking mental inventory of what would be left behind. Most of his equipment had been destroyed or confiscated months ago, but a few remnants remained: a partially disassembled spectroscope, notebooks too heavily coded to be of immediate use to anyone else, and photographs of colleagues who had vanished into the machinery of war. He allowed himself one moment of sentiment, picking up the faded photograph of the Institute staff from 1938, before everything changed. 26 faces smiled back at him. Only 3 were still alive as far as he knew. Perhaps only 2 now that Dieter had been missing for weeks. Fischer slipped the photograph into his breast pocket, rather than the briefcase. Some memories were too precious to risk losing. Beyond the shattered window, American soldiers moved through the streets with the cautious efficiency of men who had learned that victory did not guarantee safety. They had arrived 3 days ago. These young men with their chewing gum and chocolate bars, their incomprehensible slang, and their weary eyes that had seen too much to fully believe in the peace they were enforcing. Fischer had watched them from his window. These foreign boys, barely older than his students had been, now masters of the rubble that had once been a center of scientific progress. They moved differently than the German soldiers had in the final months, without the desperate tension of men who knew they were losing. Instead, they carried the burden of winners who had yet to comprehend what winning such a war actually meant. One of them had caught Fischer watching, and had raised his hand in a gesture that wasn't quite a wave and wasn't quite a salute. Fischer had nodded in return before stepping back into the shadows. It was the closest thing to human connection he had experienced in months. The sound of boots on the stairs pulled Fischer from his reverie. Heavy, deliberate steps, not the furtive movements of scavengers who had become common as hunger drove people to search abandoned buildings for anything of value. These were the steps of men with authority, men with purpose. The Americans had finally come for him, as he had known they eventually would. He had hoped for more time, just enough to organize his papers properly, to ensure that his work would be understood in its entirety rather than fragmented and potentially misused. But time had never been generous during the war, and it appeared peace would be no more accommodating. He closed the briefcase with a decisive click and set it on the desk before turning to face the door. There was no point in hiding or pretending. They would have his name on a list, his face on a photograph, his theories explained in whatever intelligence briefings they had been given. He straightened his worn jacket, a habitual gesture from days when appearances mattered, and waited. The door opened without a knock, revealing 2 American officers flanking a civilian whose expensive suit looked oddly pristine amidst the general devastation. The civilian stepped forward, extending his hand as if this were nothing more than a business meeting. "Dr. Fischer, I'm Dr. Robert Wilson, Office of Scientific Research and Development." His German was precise but heavily accented. "We've been looking for you." Fischer took the offered hand automatically, noting the firm grip, the manicured nails, the signet ring that spoke of an elite American university. A scientist turned intelligence officer then, the most dangerous kind of interrogator for someone like him, one who would understand exactly what the equations in his briefcase meant. "I've been exactly where I have always been, Dr. Wilson," Fischer replied in English, as flawless as Wilson's German was flawed. "It seems it was only a matter of who would find me first." A flicker of surprise crossed Wilson's face at Fischer's perfect English, quickly replaced by a smile that didn't reach his calculating eyes. "Yes, well, we're fortunate it was us and not our Soviet colleagues. They're being rather enthusiastic in their recruitment of German scientists." The euphemism hung in the air between them, delicate as ash. Fischer had heard the stories of Soviet recruitment methods, Colleagues who had chosen to flee west, rather than risk falling into Soviet hands, had whispered about midnight arrests, about scientists and their entire families disappearing into the vast, unknowable East. Whether American methods would prove more humane remained to be seen. Wilson gestured to the briefcase on the desk. "Is that everything?" The question had layers of meaning. Was that all of Fisher's research? All of his life's work reduced to a single leather case? All that remained of the theories that had helped create weapons capable of destroying civilization? "Everything that matters," Fisher answered, neither confirming nor denying what the briefcase might contain. Wilson nodded to one of the officers, who stepped forward to take the case. Fisher felt a momentary urge to protest, to snatch back the leather handle, to protect what was perhaps the only thing of value he had left in the world. But he remained still, watching as his papers were taken with the same detached resignation with which he had watched his laboratory dismantled, his house destroyed, his country defeated. What was one more loss in a world defined by loss? "We'll need you to come with us, Dr. Fisher," Wilson said, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "There's a facility where you'll be debriefed. After that, well, America has opportunities for men of your talents." The unspoken implication was clear. Cooperate, share your knowledge, and perhaps find a new life in the land of the victors. The alternative didn't need to be stated. Fisher looked around the attic one last time. There was nothing here for him anymore, nothing but ghosts and equations and memories of a time when science had seemed pure, devoted to understanding rather than destruction. He had survived when so many others hadn't. Perhaps that survival carried with it an obligation to ensure his work served something better than it had during the war. "I'll need my coat," he said simply. "Spring evenings are still quite cold." As they led him through the ruined streets of Göttingen, Fisher observed his hometown with the eyes of someone seeing it for both the first and last time. The university where he had taught for 23 years was now largely rubble, its once proud facades reduced to jagged teeth of stone, jutting from piles of brick dust. Students had once crossed the courtyard in animated discussion of Heisenberg's latest theories or Planck's constants. Now hollow-eyed children scavenged among the ruins, their thin bodies moving with the terrible efficiency of creatures who had adapted to a world of scarcity. They barely glanced at the American officers or their German charge. Another scientist being led away was hardly noteworthy in a city that had once been a crown jewel of physics and mathematics. Fisher wondered how many of his colleagues had walked this same path before him, escorted to American cars by American soldiers, vanishing into the machinery of the next global power. A group of women worked methodically at the corner of Wenderstrasse, sorting bricks from a collapsed building into piles. The Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, had become a common sight in German cities, these female brigades clearing the debris one stone at a time. Fischer recognized one of them, Frau Müller, who had cleaned the university offices before the war. She had lost her husband at Stalingrad and her eldest son in the final defense of Berlin. Now she methodically sorted the physical remnants of her world, the once plump face gaunt with hunger but set with determination. Their eyes met briefly as he passed. She gave no sign of recognition, just the blank stare that had become common among survivors, a look that acknowledged another human being without investing the emotional energy required for genuine connection. Too many people had disappeared to make such investments wisely. The American car waited at what had once been the town square, a sleek black anomaly amid the destruction. A small crowd had gathered to stare at the vehicle, their faces showing the complex mix of emotions that characterized German civilians in those early days after surrender. Fear of the occupiers, relief that the bombing had stopped, resentment of defeat, and the simple animal curiosity that even war couldn't extinguish. A thin man in the tattered remains of a Wehrmacht uniform stood at the edge of the crowd, one empty sleeve pinned neatly to his shoulder. When he saw Fisher being led to the car, something flashed across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or accusation. Fisher looked away. He had never worked directly on weapons development, had told himself his theoretical work was separate from its applications, but such distinctions felt hollow now. Theory became practice, equations became bombs. Intellectual abstractions became empty sleeves and hollow eyes. Inside the car, Wilson sat opposite Fisher, while the two officers took positions on either side. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, navigating carefully through streets partially blocked by debris. "You understand why we're interested in you, of course," Wilson said as the car picked up speed at the edge of town. Wasn't really a question. Fisher watched the passing landscape, the familiar rolling hills of central Germany, now dotted with the temporary encampments of displaced persons and allied military units. "I understand that my work has implications beyond the purely theoretical. What I don't yet understand is what you intend to do with it, or with me. Wilson smiled thinly. That rather depends on you, Doctor. You're not the only German scientist being, shall we say, relocated. You've heard of Operation Paperclip, I assume. Fisher had indeed heard whispers about the American program to extract German scientists before the Soviets could claim them. Colleagues had disappeared from Berlin, from Munich, from his own Göttingen, only to resurface in rumors of comfortable houses in Virginia or New Mexico, of well-equipped laboratories, and immunity from prosecution for their wartime work. A devil's bargain, some called it. A new life at the cost of working for yet another military machine. I've heard, he acknowledged, though I wonder if you've considered that some of us might be tired of seeing our work used for destruction, that some of us might prefer silence and obscurity to further contribution to the world's capacity for self-annihilation. Wilson's expression hardened slightly. A luxury the world can't afford, Dr. Fisher. The war with Germany may be over, but a new conflict is already taking shape. Your former colleagues are already working in Moscow, helping the Soviets develop the very technologies you pioneered. We can't allow that advantage to go unchallenged. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. And frankly, your preference for obscurity wasn't evident during the war. Your papers were foundational to Germany's advanced weapons research. Your theories made possible technologies that would have changed the outcome had they been implemented sooner. There was accusation in his voice now, but also respect, the complicated regard one scientist has for another, whose brilliance transcends moral judgments about its application. Fisher turned from the window to face Wilson directly. My work before the war was published openly, available to scientists of all nations. When the Nazis came to power, my choices narrowed considerably. Work for them, or disappear. I chose to work to stay alive, to try in small ways to ensure the research was never completed. He paused, memories surfacing of subtle sabotage, of deliberately introducing errors into calculations, of the constant fear of discovery. I failed in that effort, obviously. The question now is whether I'll be allowed to choose a different path, or whether I'm simply exchanging one form of coercion for another. The car slowed as they approached a checkpoint manned by American soldiers. Wilson produced papers that were examined briefly before they were waved through. Beyond the checkpoint, a convoy of military vehicles stretched along the road, transporting the material spoils of scientific victory, laboratory equipment, documents, prototypes, and the human capital of defeated Germany's intellectual class. You misunderstand the situation, Dr. Fisher, Wilson said, as the car accelerated again. We're not the Nazis. You'll be well treated, well compensated. Your family... He stopped abruptly. Consulting a small notebook he withdrew from his pocket. I apologize. I see your wife and daughter were killed in the Hamburg bombing. You have no remaining family in Germany. The casual mention of his greatest loss hit Fisher like a physical blow. For a moment he was back in Hamburg, digging through the rubble of his sister's home, where Maria and little Elise had gone to escape the intensifying bombing of Göttingen. 3 days he had searched, his hands bleeding, moving stones and shattered beams until he found them, still embracing, buried under what had been the kitchen wall. Maria had taken Elise to her sister's, believing it would be safer, a miscalculation that cost everything. No, Fisher said, his voice steady through force of will. I have no family remaining anywhere. Wilson had the grace to look uncomfortable. My condolences. The point remains that you'll be treated as a respected colleague, not a prisoner. Your expertise is valuable to us, but we're not barbarians. Fisher turned back to the window, watching the German countryside roll by, perhaps for the last time. The spring had brought a determined green to the landscape, new growth pushing through soil churned by bombs and tank treads and hasty graves. Life continuing, indifferent to human catastrophe. You know what they called me during the war? He asked quietly. Der Geisterphysiker, the ghost physicist. Because my theories seemed to come from nowhere, to make connections no one else could see, because I could make the impossible seem inevitable. He traced a pattern on the condensation of the window, a partial differential equation that had once revealed to him the secrets of particle behavior under extreme conditions. I wonder now if they called me that because I was already dead in some fundamental way. A ghost doing a ghost's work. Wilson didn't respond immediately, studying Fisher with the careful attention of a man evaluating an acquisition. The dead don't create, Doctor, he finally said, and whatever you may think of your work during the war, it was undeniably creative, revolutionary even. That kind of mind doesn't belong in the past. It belongs where it can shape the future. Fisher laughed without humor, a short, sharp sound like breaking glass. And you believe that place is America, working on weapons even more devastating than those that destroyed my family, creating theories to power the next great conflict? He shook his head. Perhaps I truly am a ghost after all, cursed to repeat my failures eternally. The car turned onto a narrow road leading to what had once been a Luftwaffe airfield, now repurposed by the occupying forces. A transport plane waited on the runway, its propellers already in lazy motion. Several other vehicles were parked nearby, disgorging passengers and cargo for the flight. Fisher recognized the distinctive profile of Dr. Kleinman, a rocket scientist from Peenemünde, being escorted toward the plane, though he would not be traveling alone. America was collecting Germany's intellectual assets with the same thoroughness it was dismantling its military capacity. "We're not asking you to work on weapons specifically," Wilson said as the car came to a stop. "Though I won't lie to you and say the military isn't interested in your theories, but America is a big country with many opportunities for research, nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, medical applications. The choice will be more yours than you might think." Fisher doubted that very much, but there seemed little point in arguing. The doors opened, and the officers gestured for him to exit the vehicle. The spring air was unexpectedly sweet, carrying the scent of distant fields and forests that had somehow survived the mechanized destruction of modern warfare. Fisher breathed deeply, wondering if American air would smell fundamentally different if he would ever adjust to its composition. Small concerns, perhaps, but it was often the smallest changes that proved most difficult to accept. The absence of familiar bread, of particular birdsong, of the quality of light specific to Central European afternoons. His papers could be transported intact, his knowledge carried in his mind, but these sensory memories would fade, replaced by the sights and sounds and smells of a place he had never wanted to see. As they approached the aircraft, Fisher noticed a small group of civilians being processed by military personnel some distance from the main loading area. They wore the mismatched clothing typical of refugees, clutching small bundles of possessions, their faces bearing the stunned expression common to those who had lost everything but their lives. Among them stood a woman holding the hand of a small boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. Something in her posture, in the protective curve of her body around the child, reminded Fisher so powerfully of Maria that he stumbled, nearly falling. The officer beside him caught his arm with a grip that managed to be both supportive and restraining. "Careful there, sir," he said in accented German. "Plane steps can be tricky." Fisher regained his balance, but continued to stare at the woman and child. Who were these civilians being evacuated alongside the scientific prizes of the Third Reich? Family members of other scientists, perhaps? Or were they something else? Witnesses, informants, human collateral in the complex negotiations of the emerging Cold Peace? The woman turned slightly, and Fisher saw that her face bore no resemblance to Maria's. Of course it didn't. Maria was ash and memory, one among millions converted from vibrant life to historical statistic. He forced himself to look away, to focus on the immediate reality of the plane, the steps, the beginning of whatever came next. Wilson guided him toward the entrance, where an American officer checked names against a manifest. "Dr. Wilhelm Fischer," Wilson announced. "Priority passenger." The officer nodded, making a notation on his clipboard without meeting Fisher's eyes. Another piece of cargo successfully loaded. Inside the aircraft, rows of utilitarian seating had been installed, already partially filled with a mix of military personnel and civilians. Fisher recognized several faces from scientific conferences before the war, men who had once been colleagues and had become, through the alchemy of politics and survival, something unclassifiable, neither friends nor strangers, fellow travelers in the most literal sense. A few nodded in recognition as he moved down the aisle. Others looked away, perhaps ashamed of their complicity, perhaps simply focused on their own uncertain futures. Fisher took the seat indicated by one of the accompanying officers, next to a window offering a last view of Germany. Wilson sat beside him, still holding the briefcase containing Fisher's papers. "We'll be taking off shortly," Wilson said. "It's about 12 hours to New York, and then another flight to New Mexico. I suggest you try to sleep if you can." Sleep seemed an absurd suggestion, but Fisher nodded politely. He doubted he would sleep properly for a very long time, if ever again. Too many dreams had become nightmares, too many quiet moments shattered by memories of things he had seen, things he had done, things he had failed to prevent. Instead, he watched the loading operation through his window, the methodical transfer of human and material resources from one empire to another. The woman and child he had noticed earlier were now boarding from a separate entrance, guided by different officers. The boy looked up as they reached the steps, his face turning briefly toward Fisher's window with an expression of solemn curiosity. For a moment, Their eyes seemed to meet across the distance, a connection between the past and whatever uncertain future awaited on the other side of the Atlantic. Then the boy was gone, vanished into the plane's interior. The engines increased their rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing through the fuselage. Wilson was speaking to him, something about security protocols and arrangements upon arrival, but Fisher wasn't listening. His attention had been captured by a figure standing at the edge of the airfield, partially hidden by a maintenance building. Even at this distance, there was something familiar about the stance, the angle of the head, the way the wind moved through dark hair that needed cutting. For an impossible moment, Fisher thought it was Dieter Hoffmann, his most brilliant student, reported missing after the fall of Berlin. The figure raised a hand, not quite a wave and not quite a salute, exactly as the American soldier had done days earlier. Then a ground crew vehicle moved between them, and when it passed, the figure was gone. Perhaps it had been Dieter. Perhaps it had been merely another ghost, another fragment of memory inserting itself into reality. In the new world taking shape, it was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between the two. The plane began to move, taxiing toward the runway with the inexorable momentum of history itself. Fisher pressed his hand against the cool glass of the window, feeling the vibration of the engines through his palm. Below, Germany receded, scars of war visible in the patchwork of destruction and survival that marked the landscape. Fields waiting to be planted, forests with new gaps like missing teeth, roads clogged with the human tide of displacement, and somewhere down there, in a cemetery in Hamburg, two simple markers for a wife and daughter who had become collateral damage in humanity's most devastating experiment in self-destruction. Wooden markers that would eventually rot, returning to the earth just as the names they bore faded from living memory. The plane lifted off, the pressure of acceleration pushing Fisher back into his seat. The physical sensation matched the emotional one, being pulled away from everything familiar, propelled by forces beyond his control toward a destination he had never chosen. As the aircraft climbed, the landscape below transformed from specific detail to abstract pattern, individual structures and roads blending into the larger tapestry of human organization across the land. This was how history viewed human experience, Fisher thought, from a height that rendered individual suffering invisible, that transformed personal catastrophe into statistical inevitability, that made the deaths of millions appear as logical as the changing seasons. But he had lived it at ground level, had felt the heat of burning buildings on his face, had held his wife and daughter's cooling hands in his own. However high this plane might climb, he would carry that ground-level truth with him. Wilson was still speaking, outlining the structure of the research facility where Fisher would be working, the accommodations that had been prepared, the other scientists who had already been integrated into the program. The briefcase containing Fisher's papers sat on Wilson's lap, one hand resting protectively on its surface as if the equations inside might somehow escape, if not physically restrained. Fisher let the words wash over him without response, watching the clouds drift below. White islands in a blue vastness that recognized no national boundaries, no ideological divisions, no human categories of victor and vanquished. Soon enough, he would need to engage with this new reality, to navigate the complex social and professional landscape of scientific work under yet another military apparatus. But for now, suspended between continents, between past and future, between identities, he allowed himself the luxury of silence. When Wilson finally fell silent, perhaps recognizing that his passenger was not yet ready for the details of his new life, Fisher turned slightly toward him. "Tell me, Dr. Wilson," he said quietly, "do you ever wonder about the moral weight of what we do? As scientists, I mean, about our responsibility for how our work is applied?" Wilson's expression shifted, surprise giving way to a guarded thoughtfulness. He glanced around to ensure no one was listening to their conversation, though most of the other passengers appeared to be either sleeping or lost in their own contemplations of exile. "Of course," Wilson admitted in a lower voice. "After Trinity, the first atomic test, Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.' Many of us felt that weight." Fisher nodded, appreciating the unexpected candor. "And yet you continued. You built more bombs, more destructive than the first. You dropped them on cities." He kept his voice neutral, an observation rather than an accusation. After all, who was he to judge? His own work, however theoretical, had contributed to weapons that had killed thousands. Wilson's jaw tightened. "We were at war. The bombs ended it, saved lives ultimately. The invasion of Japan would have—" He stopped himself, perhaps recognizing the futility of justifications that had likely already been repeated to the point of mantra. "Yes, we continued. Just as you continued your work for the Reich, despite knowing how it would be used, we tell ourselves what we must to keep going. There was a bitter honesty in his voice that Fischer found oddly comforting. Perhaps in America, among the victors, there might be space for the moral ambiguity that defeat had forced upon German scientists. I told myself I was introducing subtle errors, Fischer said, matching Wilson's quiet tone. Flaws in the mathematics that would prevent the worst applications from succeeding. And sometimes I did, but not always, not enough. He turned back to the window. They were above the cloud layer now, the world below hidden from view, as remote as the ethical certainties of his youth. I wonder if that's the true danger of our work, not the weapons we help create, but the lies we tell ourselves to justify our complicity in their creation. Wilson didn't respond immediately, his reflection in the window showing an expression of uncomfortable recognition. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its official authority. In Los Alamos there's a joke, though not a particularly funny one. How many scientists does it take to destroy the world? None. The politicians will do it themselves. The scientists just make it more efficient. Fischer smiled without humor. Ah yes, the comforting myth of scientific neutrality. Knowledge is innocent. Only its application can be judged. I believed that once. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, shuddering briefly before stabilizing, a metaphor too obvious to require articulation. Do you know what I was working on at the end? Not weapons directly, but something potentially more dangerous. Unified field theory that suggested, no, demonstrated, that matter and energy are more fundamentally interchangeable than even Einstein proposed. The implications for weapon development are significant. He watched Wilson carefully as he spoke, noting the subtle shifts in expression that confirmed the American already knew at least the broad outlines of his research. My calculations indicated that with the right approach, the energy yield of nuclear reactions could be increased by orders of magnitude beyond what your Manhattan Project achieved. Fortunately, the theoretical requirements exceeded Germany's technological capabilities. For now, Wilson's grip on the briefcase tightened almost imperceptibly. You included these findings in your papers? He asked, glancing down at the case as if it might suddenly increase in temperature. Fischer shook his head. Not all of them. The most critical derivations exist only here. He tapped his temple lightly. I destroyed those papers when it became clear Berlin would fall. Some knowledge shouldn't be preserved, regardless of which flag flies over the laboratory. He didn't add that this destruction had been his own small act of resistance, perhaps the only meaningful one he had managed during the entire war. Let Wilson believe that America was getting the complete Fischer archive. Some secrets needed to remain secret, at least until he could determine whether his new masters would be more responsible with world-shattering knowledge than his previous ones had been. The admission seemed to both relieve and concern Wilson. You'll want to reconstruct those derivations once you're settled, for the scientific record, if nothing else. His tone made it clear this was an expectation, not a suggestion. Fischer merely nodded, non-committal. The request was predictable and would be the first of many tests of his cooperation, his loyalty to his new patrons. Each response would define the parameters of his new existence, the degree of freedom or constraint he would experience. A complex equation with many variables, the solution to which was not yet clear. He would need to calculate carefully. As the plane continued eastward, leaving Europe behind with every mile, Fischer found himself thinking of the boy he had glimpsed boarding the aircraft. What future awaited that child in America? Would he grow up remembering Germany, or would the war and its aftermath fade into the imperfect haze of early childhood memory? Would he perhaps someday become a scientist himself, inheriting the complex moral legacy that Fischer and his generation were creating? These were questions without answers, projections into a future that seemed simultaneously predetermined by the momentum of history and wildly uncertain in its specific contours. Fischer had once believed in scientific determinism, in the comforting notion that with enough information and computational power, all outcomes could be predicted. The war had cured him of that particular delusion. Some variables could never be fully known, some systems too complex for any equation to capture. Wilson had fallen into a light sleep beside him, his grip on the briefcase relaxing slightly, though his arm remained protectively draped across it. Fischer considered the sleeping American, this man who would help shape whatever came next. Not a villain, not a hero, but something more complex, a functionary of power who nevertheless possessed his own doubts, his own internal conflicts. In another life, under different circumstances, they might have been colleagues in the purest sense, collaborating in the advancement of knowledge for its own sake. But history had placed them in this specific relationship, victor and vanquished, captor and captive, employer and asset. The personal complexity of the man did not change the fundamental power dynamic between them. Outside the window, the sun was setting behind them, casting long shadows across the cloud tops, creating a landscape of light and darkness as intricate and varied as the ethical terrain Fisher had navigated throughout the war. He had never wanted to be a warrior or a weapon maker. As a young man entering the university, he had dreamed of understanding the fundamental laws of the universe, of adding one small piece to humanity's collective knowledge. When had that pure desire for understanding transformed into something darker? Was it when he first accepted funding from a government he despised but could not refuse? When he first realized that his theories could be applied to destruction as easily as to creation? Or was it more gradual, a series of small compromises, each seemingly necessary and justified in the moment, that led eventually to a place he had never intended to go? Perhaps America would offer, if not redemption, then at least the opportunity to redirect his work toward less destructive ends. Wilson had mentioned energy production, medical applications. Perhaps there was a path back toward the kind of science Fisher had once loved, the pursuit of knowledge that improved human life rather than threatened it. Or perhaps that was simply another comforting lie, another self-deception to make the next compromise easier to accept. The great curse of knowledge was that once gained, could not be unlearned. His theories existed now in his mind, and at least partially in the papers that Wilson guarded so carefully. They would be used one way or another by one power or another. The most he could hope for was some small influence over how and when. The cabin lights dimmed, encouraging passengers to sleep during the long Atlantic crossing. Fisher remained awake, watching the darkness gather outside, feeling the subtle vibrations of the engines through the airframe. This metal capsule carrying him toward an unknowable future seemed an apt metaphor for his life since the rise of Hitler, confined, directed by external forces, suspended between what was and what would be. Yet even within this confined space, certain choices remained: how he would engage with his new circumstances, what knowledge he would share freely, and what he would withhold. Whether he would allow himself to become merely a tool of yet another military-industrial complex, or whether he could maintain some core of independent scientific integrity. As the last light faded from the western horizon, Fisher thought again of the name they had given him during the war, der Geisterphysiker, the ghost physicist. Perhaps there was power in that identity, in being not quite fully present, not quite fully bound by the physical and political constraints that defined ordinary existence. Ghosts, after all, could pass through walls, could appear and disappear at will, could influence the living world while remaining partially separate from it. If he was to be a ghost in this new life, perhaps he could be a ghost with purpose, with agency, despite his apparent captivity. The thought offered a small measure of comfort as the plane continued eastward through the gathering darkness, carrying its cargo of human knowledge and human frailty toward the dawn of the atomic age. The hours passed in the peculiar timelessness of long-distance air travel. Some passengers slept fitfully, others stared at nothing, lost in private thoughts. Occasionally, someone would make their way down the narrow aisle to the rudimentary facilities at the rear of the aircraft, moving carefully to avoid disturbing others. Fisher noticed Dr. Kleinman several rows ahead, his distinctive bald head visible above the seatback, bent over what appeared to be a small notebook. Still working, still calculating, perhaps already adapting his rocket designs to meet American specifications rather than German ones. The science itself didn't care which flag it served, which ideology justified its application. The equations remained the same, regardless of the language in which they were expressed. Only the human context changed, the moral framework within which the science operated. Fisher must have eventually dozed, despite his intention to remain awake, for he found himself suddenly alert, disoriented by the change in the plane's engine sound as it began its descent. Grey light filtered through the window, illuminating an unfamiliar coastline below as the cloud layer thinned. America, or at least its eastern edge, coming into view with the inevitability of a calculated trajectory reaching its predetermined conclusion. Wilson stirred beside him, straightening in his seat, checking instinctively for the briefcase that had never left his possession. "Ah, we're approaching New York," he said, his voice thick with interrupted sleep. "You'll only be here briefly. There's a connecting flight to New Mexico leaving in a few hours." Fisher nodded, studying the landscape below with the detached interest of a scientist observing a new experimental environment. The coast gave way to densely packed urban development, the geometry of a city built on confidence, rather than the cautious accretion of centuries that characterized European urban centers. Even from this height, there was an unmistakable vitality to the place, an absence of the bombed-out gaps that now defined the cities of Germany. Here was a nation untouched by war on its own soil, its infrastructure intact, its buildings reaching confidently skyward. Fisher tried to imagine himself in this place, walking these streets, shopping in these markets, perhaps someday owning a home in one of the residential areas visible as they descended further. The image refused to form clearly, like a projection on an unsuitable surface. As the plane touched down with a series of jolts, Fisher felt a peculiar sensation in his chest, a tightness that was not quite pain and not quite fear. It took him a moment to recognize it as a form of grief, not the raw, overwhelming anguish he had felt digging through the rubble for Maria and Elise, but something more subtle, a mourning for the self he had been and would never be again. Wilhelm Fischer, German physicist, husband, father, citizen of a nation with a specific history and culture, had ceased to exist. Who would emerge in his place remained to be determined, shaped by forces both external and internal, by choices yet to be made and circumstances yet to unfold. The realization was both terrifying and oddly liberating, like standing at the edge of a precipice that represented both possible destruction and possible flight. The plane taxied to a stop near a hangar separated from the main airport facilities. No ordinary passenger terminal for this cargo, Fisher noted. No immigration procedures or customs declarations for these particular imports. The door opened, letting in a rush of American air, different indeed from that of Göttingen, carrying the scent of ocean and petroleum and some indefinable quality that perhaps represented the essence of a younger country. Wilson stood, gesturing for Fisher to precede him down the aisle. "Welcome to the United States, Dr. Fisher," he said with a formality that underscored the historical significance he clearly attached to this moment. "Your new life begins here." Fisher rose, moving toward the door with the same measured pace he had once used when entering his classroom at the university, neither hurried nor hesitant. At the exit he paused, looking back at the other passengers, the other scientific assets being transferred from one empire to another. Their faces showed various stages of the same process he was experiencing: disorientation, resignation, cautious hope, calculation of new parameters and possibilities. Steinman caught his eye and offered a small nod that contained volumes of shared understanding. Then Fisher turned and descended the steps into his new reality, his ghost self, taking its first material steps on American soil. On the tarmac, a small welcoming committee waited, more military personnel, more civilians in expensive suits, more clipboards and files and the apparatus of bureaucratic processing. A photographer stood to one side, documenting the arrival of this particular planeload of intellectual spoils. Fisher wondered briefly where these photos would be filed, what reports they would illustrate, how his image would be catalogued and cross-referenced in the vast administrative machinery of his new government. Behind him, he sensed rather than saw Wilson following closely, still carrying the briefcase containing the papers that had made Fisher valuable enough to extract from the ruins of Germany. The briefcase that contained most, but not all, of what he knew about the fundamental nature of matter and energy, about the theoretical underpinnings of weapons that could dwarf even the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As he was led toward a waiting car, Fisher noticed the woman and child he had seen earlier being escorted to a separate vehicle. The boy looked around with the wide-eyed wonder of childhood, perhaps too young to fully comprehend the significance of this transition, the irrevocable alteration of his life's trajectory. Fisher envied him that partial innocence, that capacity for absorption without complete understanding. The boy turned as if sensing Fisher's attention, and their eyes met briefly across the tarmac. The child offered a small, solemn wave, a gesture both ordinary and profound in its human connection. Fisher returned it, feeling an unexpected surge of emotion, a reminder of the simple human interactions that persisted even amid the complex geopolitical calculations that had brought them all to this place. The car door opened, and Fisher ducked inside, entering the next chapter of a story whose ending remained unwritten. As the door closed with a solid thunk of American engineering, he considered the possible paths forward from this moment: cooperation or resistance, revelation or concealment, integration or perpetual otherness. Each choice would shape not only his own future, but potentially the future of the world his work might help create or destroy. The car pulled away from the plane, carrying him further into this new continent, this new reality. Whatever came next would be at least partially of his own making, ghost or not. That thought, with its implication of continued agency despite his changed circumstances, offered a fragile hope, as bright and tenuous as the morning sunlight filtering through the car window. Perhaps there were still choices to be made, still possibilities for redemption, or at least for preventing the worst applications of his knowledge. Perhaps this forced migration represented not merely an ending, but also a beginning, a chance to ensure that the next chapter of human history would not be written in the language of destruction his work had previously enabled. As the car joined a convoy heading toward a guarded gate, Fisher took one last look at the plane that had carried him across the Atlantic. From this distance, it seemed almost fragile, a metal tube that had somehow suspended him between worlds, between identities, between the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. Like Schrödinger's theoretical cat, he had existed during that journey in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously the person he had been and the person he would become. Now, with his arrival on American soil, that waveform had collapsed into a new reality, with new constraints and new possibilities. The physicist in him appreciated the elegance of the metaphor. The human being in him felt the profound disorientation of such a fundamental transformation. The guard gate receded behind them as the car accelerated onto a highway leading away from the airport. Ahead lay an America he knew only from books and films, from scientific journals and wartime intelligence reports. A vast, complex nation that had emerged from the war stronger than before, its industrial might intact, its scientific enterprise energized by wartime necessity, and now pivoting toward whatever would define the post-war era. Somewhere in that landscape was the laboratory where he would work, the house where he would live, the community in which he would either find a place or remain forever an outsider, a ghost from a vanquished nation. The thought should have terrified him, perhaps, but instead he felt a curious calmness. He had survived when so many hadn't. He carried within him knowledge that could help shape the future, for better or worse. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his scientific work. Observation, analysis, hypothesis, experiment, conclusion. The scientific method applied to the experiment of existence itself. Wilson sat opposite him again, a briefcase still on his lap, his expression suggesting a man already moving on to the next tasks in a complex operation. "There will be a detailed debriefing when we reach the facility," he said, his tone returning to the official register of their first meeting. "After that, you'll be introduced to your colleagues and shown your living quarters. I think you'll find the arrangements quite comfortable, certainly more so than what you left behind." Fisher nodded, acknowledging the statement without necessarily agreeing with its implications. Comfort was a relative concept, defined as much by internal state as by external conditions. He doubted he would find true comfort anywhere in the foreseeable future, regardless of the material provisions made for him. As the car continued westward, Fisher considered what he would say in the coming debriefings, what he would reveal and what he would keep hidden. He thought of the derivations he had destroyed rather than risk their falling into any hands, German or Allied. He thought of the theoretical breakthroughs he had never committed to paper, carrying them only in his mind, where they remained his alone to reveal or conceal. He thought of the ethical lines he had crossed and those he had refused to cross, the complex moral calculus of a scientist working under a regime he despised. And he wondered what new calculations awaited him in this new context, what compromises would be demanded, what opportunities might arise to direct his knowledge toward healing rather than harming. The morning sun illuminated the American landscape streaming past the car window, revealing a country largely untouched by the physical destruction that had transformed Europe. No bomb craters scarring the earth, no collapsed buildings lining the roads, no hollow-eyed civilians picking through rubble for scraps of usable material. This physical intactness seemed almost surreal after years surrounded by the evidence of mankind's capacity for self-destruction. Yet Fisher knew that absence of physical damage didn't mean absence of change. America too had been transformed by the war, perhaps less visibly but no less profoundly. The nation that had developed the atomic bomb, that had unleashed a power previously reserved for gods, could never return to its pre-war innocence. Just as he could never return to the person he had been before, America could never again be what it had been. They were, in that sense, appropriate companions for whatever came next, both forever altered by what they had created, both facing a future shaped by forces they had helped unleash, but might not be able to control. As the highway curved, revealing a sprawling cityscape ahead, Fisher took a deep breath of American air, filling his lungs with the atmosphere of his new reality. Whatever awaited him, redemption or further compromise, freedom or subtle imprisonment, the opportunity to heal or the obligation to harm, he would face it with the clear-eyed assessment of the scientist he had always been. Some equations had no elegant solutions, requiring instead approximations and acceptances of imperfection. Perhaps his life had become such an equation, complex beyond clean resolution, but still worthy of careful calculation, still capable of yielding meaningful results, despite its inherent uncertainties. With that thought, he turned his attention fully to the approaching city, to the next stage of an experiment whose parameters had changed, but whose essential question remained the same: how to exist as a human being in a world where knowledge brought both wonder and terror, both possibility and responsibility. The future, with all its variables and constants, its knowns and unknowns, stretched before him like a landscape glimpsed through morning mist, partially revealed, partially concealed, but inescapably present and demanding to be navigated. Der Geisterphysiker would continue his work, visible or invisible, remembered or forgotten, seeking not certainty but understanding in a world where the two could never be fully reconciled. That perhaps was both the burden and the gift of knowledge, the paradox at the heart of human existence that no equation could ever fully resolve. As the car carried him deeper into America, deeper into his new life, deeper into the complex moral territory of post-war science, Fisher accepted both the burden and the gift, the paradox and the responsibility, with the quiet determination that had carried him through war and would now carry him through whatever peace might bring. If human history is a tapestry woven of countless individual threads, then we must consider how the patterns change when certain threads are deliberately hidden or obscured. In the aftermath of war, as nations rebuild both their cities and their narratives, some stories are elevated while others are systematically erased. Forgotten geniuses who changed the course of history only to disappear into its shadows remind us that our understanding of the past is always incomplete, always subject to the distortions of power and purpose. As we stand amid our own ruins, whether physical, psychological, or moral, perhaps we would do well to search for these missing threads, to acknowledge the complexity they add to our collective story. For in the silence that follows the bombs, in the spaces between official histories and personal memories, we might find the truths that help us navigate our present moments of destruction and creation, of ending and beginning. The past never truly disappears. It simply waits to be rediscovered by those willing to look beyond the authorized version of events, to hear the whispers of ghosts who continue to shape our world long after they have seemingly vanished from it.